What's up, everybody? This is chapter 4 of John E. Kelly's Twilight of World Trotskyism. This chapter is titled The Dynamics of World Trotskyism. The subsections are, or the subheadings are, the baleful influence of Stalinism, ? The cycles of protest and the absence of Trotskyist party growth and influence, Trotskyist-led social movements, the Bolivian and Sri Lankan success stories, and conclusions. Get to the actual chapter now. All right. Wait, where am I? 62 is where I'm going. Get me to 62. All right. Let's rock. Trotsky's famous 1938 comment about the, quote, historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat, end quote, was a declaration of the implacable hostility of his new organization and its affiliates to all existing working class leaderships, Stalinists, social democrats, anarchists, and trade union bureaucracies alike. The major aim of Trotskyist organizations was therefore to challenge the hegemonic position of these rival tendencies and ultimately to supplant them. It is clear from many contemporary Trotskyist documents that the emphasis on, quote, leadership, end quote, often loosely and unhelpfully described as, quote, the subjective factor, end quote, persists to this day. In his mid-1990s study of Trotsky, mainstream Fourth International militant Ernest Mandel maintained that, quote, in the imperialist countries, the main obstacle to the seizure of power is the growing conservatism of the leadership of the organized labor movement, end quote. A similar theme has recently been reiterated by a host of organizations, including the French Fourth International Breakaway led by Daniel Gluckstein, CORQI, Lutte Ouvrière, Union Communiste Internationaliste, 1988, and a host of Latin American internationals, including the Facción Trotskyista, Cuarta Internacional, 2013, the LITCI 2020, and the LIS 2020, as well as the tiny British Socialist Equality Party 2011, and the equally minuscule League for the Fifth International 2010. The focus of Trotskyist denunciation varies across time and place. In Britain and parts of Western Europe, social democratic parties have been targeted as the main enemies. More recently, radical left parties such as Podemos, Syriza, and the Brazilian Workers' Party have come under fire, whilst in southern Europe, parts of Asia, and many countries in Latin and Central America, the strong local communist parties have attracted Trotskyist ire. Because Trotskyism first emerged as a current within world communism and repeatedly directed much of its intellectual fire at what it took to be the key precepts of Stalinist communism, particularly the ideas of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, and the, quote, popular front, end quote, it makes sense to explore the extent to which it is the world communist movement that has significantly inhibited the growth of world Trotskyism. If communist hegemony can be thought of as the major threat to Trotskyist influence, then class struggles of various kinds may be considered the main opportunity for Trotskyist growth. That issue will comprise the second part of this chapter on the dynamics of Trotskyist movements, in which we shall also examine the two countries, Bolivia and Sri Lanka, that are often regarded as Trotskyist success stories. The baleful influence of Stalinism, new section. The popularity of the world's communist parties rose through the fascist era, particularly from the mid-1930s, and reached its apogee in the late 1940s following the vital role of the Red Army in the destruction of Nazism. For instance, many West European parties achieved their highest ever vote shares in the immediate post-World War II elections. See Donald Sassoon, 1996, pages 95 to 96. The weakness and general irrelevance of the Trotskyist movement throughout the 1950s and the early 1960s is readily applicable by reference to communist and social democratic strength, not to mention hostility. But the onset of the Cold War marked the beginning of a prolonged process of communist decline, differing in pace and timing from one country to another and occasionally thrown into reverse, but clearly shaped and defined by a series of significant and traumatic events in the Soviet bloc. The East German Workers' Uprising, 1953, Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's crimes in the 1956, quote, secret speech, end quote. The Soviet invasion of Hungary later that year, the Sino-Soviet split triggered by the secret speech and intensifying over the next few years, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and its defeat and withdrawal 1988 to 89, the collapse of the East European communist states starting in 1989 and culminating in the collapse and disintegration of the USSR in 1991. See, for example, Brown 2009, First et al. 2017, Part 1, Thompson 1998. All of these events impacted negatively on communist parties around the world, weakening their influence, support, and membership, as well as the ideological foundation stones on which they have been constructed over many decades. See, for example, Fourth International 2010. These processes in turn created the conditions under which Trotskyist organizations could flourish, as many did in the, quote, golden age, end quote, from the late 1960s until the late 1980s, above all in Western Europe, especially France and Britain, Latin America, notably Argentina and Brazil, and the USA. Yet this phase of relatively spectacular growth was followed almost everywhere by a period of disintegration and decline that stretched into the 2000s, abated for a decade or so, and then resumed from the late teens, see above. Trotskyist growth was not checked in the 1990s because the communist movement somehow recovered from the ruins of the Soviet collapse. On the contrary, the demise of most of the world's communist states was as damaging for world Trotskyism as it was for the world's communist parties. While some Trotskyists rightly foresaw that their organizations would be caught up in the powerful slipstream of Soviet disintegration, many shared the over-optimistic assessment of Kalinikos. That's Alexander Kalinikos. Quote, classical Marxism can finally shake itself free of the Stalinist incubus and seize the opportunities offered by a world experiencing greater, quote, uncertainty and agitation, end quote, than for many decades. It is time to resume unfinished business, end quote. See Kalinikos, 1991, 136, and see also Gonzalez, 2014, for a similar view on Latin America. It is therefore worth reminding ourselves of the depth and scope of the decline of world communism. As the East European and Soviet collapse gathered pace from the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, an astonishing 39 communist parties disappeared entirely either through dissolution, transformation into social democratic parties, or repression, most notably in Asia and Eastern Europe. There were 15 parties across all continents that voted for dissolution between 1989 and 1991, including those in Afghanistan, Australia, Great Britain, Honduras, Italy, Malaysia, Mexico, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Thailand. Many others, 21 in all, abandoned their communist identity and immediately relaunched as social democratic parties, particularly in the ex-communist states such as Hungary, Mongolia, Slovakia, and the Ukraine. Finally, governments in the three newly liberated Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, wreaked revenge on their former Soviet rulers by declaring their respective communist parties to be illegal organizations. Amongst the communist parties that survived the Soviet collapse, the overwhelming majority, 61 in total, have been locked into membership and electoral decline for several decades or oftentimes much longer. Within Western Europe, the parties of the Benelux countries have been losing votes and members since the 1950s, whilst the decline of the five mass parties of Southern Europe is more recent, dating from the 1970s and early 1980s. The only parties to avoid this fate have done so by transforming themselves into radical left parties, most notably in Scandinavia, e.g. Left Alliance in Finland, Vasemmistoliitto, and the Left Party in Sweden, Vänsterpartiet. In Latin America, long-term decline has afflicted the communist parties of countries such as Costa Rica, Paraguay, Venezuela, whilst more recent declines have afflicted an equally diverse range of countries, including Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Peru. It is a similar story in many African and Asian countries, with loss of political influence by the larger communist parties of Egypt, India, Nigeria, Sudan, and Turkey. In none of these 61 countries has the local Trotskyist movement become a significant political player. Indeed, many are countries where Trotskyist groups have proven too weak to mount even a single electoral challenge to mainstream parties, e.g. Egypt. See Naguib, 2021, 305. What all of this evidence suggests is that world communism has played a complex and contradictory role in relation to Trotskyism. Its power and influence was strongly associated with Trotskyist weakness until the early 1960s. The gathering pace of its decline gave a tremendous boost to the fortunes of world Trotskyism during the 1970s and 1980s. But its dissolution and continued decline after 1991 has proceeded hand in hand with the decline, not the advance, of its Trotskyist adversary. New section. Cycles of protest and the absence of Trotskyist party growth and influence. It could be argued following Marx that the class consciousness required to vote for, join, or participate in a Trotskyist group will only emerge under exceptional circumstances, periods of large-scale protest and revolts in which the class struggle registers new peaks of intensity. In this regard, Chunara, 2020, recently argued there have been three major cycles of world protest over the past 30 years. The late 1990s to mid-2000s centered on Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, and Venezuela. The Arab Spring starting in 2011 and embracing Bahrain, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, and Yemen, as well as protests in the USA and the wave of European strikes centered around Belgium and the 5 countries of southern Europe, France, Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, and finally the geographically broad and disparate wave of protests 2019 to 2020, located primarily in Algeria, Guinea, Sudan, Hong Kong, Iran, Iraq, Kazakhstan, Lebanon, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Haiti, France, and Spain. To this trio of periods, we can add the world strike wave and the associated protests, 1968 to 79. See Kelly, 1998, Chapter 6. Finally, going further back in time, we should examine the revolutionary situations that have emerged since the middle of the 20th century, even in which the nascent Trotskyist movement could have participated in events in which the nascent Trotskyist movement could have participated and flourished. Following Goldstone, we define a revolution as the, quote, forcible overthrow of a government through mass mobilization, whether military or civilian or both, in the name of social justice to create new political institutions, end quote. The list he compiled on the basis of this definition is as follows: Eastern Europe 1945 to 48, Greece 1945 to 1948, Yugoslavia 1945, Vietnam 1945 to 75, China 1949, Bolivia 1952, Eastern Europe revolts 1953 to 81, German Democratic Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, Algeria 1954 to 62, Cuba 1959, France 1968, Ethiopia 1974, Portugal 1974 to 75, Angola 1975, Mozambique 1975, Cambodia 1975, Laos 1975, Afghanistan 1978, Iran 1979, Nicaragua 1979, Grenada 1979, Eastern Europe 1989, and the USSR 1991. See Goldstone, 1994. We've already established that the 1970s marked a turning point in the fortunes of world Trotskyism, as hitherto tiny organizations numbering dozens or a few hundred at most were transformed into larger bodies. The most successful groups, the American Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, Socialist Workers' Party and Militant Tendency in Britain, Lutte Ouvrière, and the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, LCR, in France, recruited thousands of activists, both college students and workers alike. That cycle of protest was, without doubt, enormously beneficial for world Trotskyism, notwithstanding the downside of increased sectarianism and fragmentation, both nationally and internationally. But what of the 28 countries involved in the 3 more recent, quote, cycles of protest, end quote? In the first place, we should note that despite the protests, uprisings, and civil wars that comprise the, quote, Arab Spring, end quote, stretching from North Africa across to the Middle East, there are still no Trotskyist groups at all in many of the countries involved, namely Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. The same is true of Guinea and West Africa as well as Ecuador, and unsurprisingly there has been no resurgence of Trotskyism in the repressive and authoritarian theocracy of Iran. In a further 7 countries, the Trotskyist movement remains so feeble that it has not managed to promote even a single candidate in a national election since the start of the millennium, including countries with a history of Trotskyist activities such as Bolivia and Colombia. And the other countries in that category are Egypt, Haiti, Hong Kong, Kazakhstan, and Tunisia. Where independent Trotskyist candidates have contested national elections in the wake of widespread protests, their level of support has remained derisory, typically less than 1% of the vote in seats often chosen through their high levels of Trotskyist party activity. Those 10 countries and their respective Trotskyist party are as follows: Belgium, Parti Socialiste de Lutte and Lutte Ouvrière; Brazil, Partido da Causa Operaia and Partido Socialista dos Trabalhadores Unificado; Chile, Partido de Trabajadores Revolucionarios; France, POI and Lutte Ouvrière; Greece, Antarcia and Ergatico Epanastatico; Coma, Workers' Revolutionary Party; Italy, Partito Comunista del Lavoratori and Partito di Alternativa Comunista; Portugal, Movimento Alternativa Socialista and Partido Operário de Unidade Socialista; Spain, Izquierda Anticapitalista Revolucionario, Lucha Internacionalista and Partido Obrero Socialista Internacionalista; USA, Socialist Equality Party and the Socialist Workers' Party; and Venezuela, Partido Socialismo y Libertad. Southern European countries are especially interesting because of the unusually large numbers of general strikes staged repeatedly from 1980 onwards, with peaks in the early 1990s, early 2000s, and the period of 2010 to 13, and because of their relatively proportional electoral systems. There is only one country from Chunara's list in which an independent Trotskyist party has achieved any degree of electoral impact, and that is Algeria, where the Lambertist Parti des Travailleurs, Parti des Travailleurs, or Travailleurs, I'm not sure, or Travailleur, I'm not how to say that, has regularly secured between 2% and 5% of the national vote, giving it continuous representation in the National Assembly since 1997. The impact of the protests and demonstrations documented by Chunara is not to be found amongst the insubstantial ranks of world Trotskyism, but in the realignment of party systems marked by the rise of the Greens and the radical left parties, RLPs. Green parties first appeared in Germany and Britain in the 1970s, but by the end of the following decade were ubiquitous in the West and also beginning to appear in parts of Latin America, Brazil, and Uruguay, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel, and Africa, Burkina Faso, and South Africa. They varied significantly in their political orientation. Some were de facto single-issue organizations. Others were already evolving into mainstream parties with positions on a variety of issues. Some were close to center parties, but many increasingly leaned leftwards towards social democracy. By the second decade of the 20th century, many of the European Green parties had established a significant mass following and representation in national legislatures. With the strongest parties, April 2022, located in Germany, 118 delegates out of 736 seats in the lower house. Austria, 26 of 183. Switzerland, 28 out of 200. Belgium, 13 out of 150. And Denmark, 13 out of 179. The other new leftist political formation to emerge from the 1990s onward was the, quote, radical left party, end quote. An organization that is, quote, against neoliberalism, anti-capitalist, opposed to existing power structures, and internationalist, ... end quote. The most well-known exemplars are Bloco de Esquerda, Left Bloc Portugal, Die Linke, Germany, Podemos, Spain, Socialistische Partei, Netherlands, Syriza, Greece, March 2011. Although the RLP label has not, to my knowledge, been applied elsewhere, it might well cover Latin American bodies such as the Brazilian PT and the new leftist parties in Venezuela, Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela, Bolivia, Movimiento al Socialismo, and Ecuador, Alianza Patria Altiva y Soberano, Proud and Sovereign Homeland. See Satter, 2011. Pivoting against social democratic rivals to their right and communist and Trotskyist groups to their left, and led by popular and charismatic politicians including Mélenchon, France, Tsipras, Greece, Iglesias, Spain, Morales, Bolivia, and Chavez, Venezuela, these parties achieved substantial electoral successes in the wake of protest strikes and demonstrations. Here has a list of radical left party vote shares. So, France's La France Insoumise in the year 2017 reached 11.3% of the legislature, and in 2022 reached 21% of the presidential election. In Greece, Syriza in January 2015 achieved 36%. In Italy, Rifondazione Comunista in 1996 peaked at 8.5%. In Portugal, Bloco de Esquerda in 2015 peaked at 10%. Spain, Podemos in 2016 achieved 21%. In Bolivia, Movimiento al Socialismo in 2009 peaked at 64.2% legislature and president. In Brazil, Partido dos Trabalhadores peaked in 2002 at 18% in the legislature, and in 2002 at 46% in the presidential. Ecuador's Alianza País party, PAIS party, peaked in 2013 with 52.3% in the legislature and 57.1% in the presidential. And Venezuela's Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela peaked in 2010 at 48% for the legislature, and 2018 they peaked at 67% for the presidential. Where am I? Okay, so that's the end of the chart. Back to the text. As with the Greens, the radical left parties have also secured significant representation in their national legislatures, and current April 2022 figures for Western Europe are as follows: Bloco de Esquerda, 19 out of 230 seats, Die Linke, 39 out of 736 seats, Podemos, 35 out of 350 seats, Socialistische Partei, 9 out of 150, and Syriza, 86 out of 300. At one time or another, they have become governing parties singly or in coalition. In all but two of these countries, France and Portugal, are the exceptions. It is true that Trotskyist groups have operated as interest factions in most of these parties, the exceptions being the French and Portuguese organizations, which were left and far left coalitions from the outset. But the votes for these radical left parties tells us nothing whatever about the popularity or otherwise of Trotskyist programs. The electoral success of both the Greens and the radical left parties suggests there is a substantial electoral constituency on the left and far left that has grown as the communist movement has declined. Yet the figures on party memberships and voting suggest that this constituency has for many years overwhelmingly rejected all varieties of Trotskyism. Finally, what of the revolutionary situations from 1945 listed earlier? This issue is more clear-cut because Trotskyist groups simply did not exist in 20 of those countries, including Eastern Europe and the USSR in the late 1980s, as well as Algeria in 1954, Angola and Mozambique 1975, Laos and Cambodia 1975, and Afghanistan 1978. There were no Trotskyist groups in Iran or Nicaragua. At the onset of their respective revolutions, and their belated appearance in both countries made no impact on the course of events. In the 7 countries of Eastern Europe, the tiny Trotskyist groups that survived the 1930s were crushed by the Nazis and had largely ceased to exist by the post-war Soviet takeovers. In 4 countries, Greece, Vietnam, China, and Cuba, significant numbers of Trotskyists were active in revolutionary struggles as junior partners and critics of their communist rivals. The first 3 of these revolutions were fought under the shadow of Stalin's Soviet Union, and Trotskyist militants therefore met the same fate as their Russian counterparts in the 1930s. Large-scale killings took place in Greece in the mid-1940s and in Vietnam and China in the early 1950s. See Alexander 1991, pages 216 to 217, 505 to 506, 969 to 71. In Cuba, a few members of the Uruguayan Posadas Party, the POR, were involved in the revolution but were certainly not leading players. Tolerated for a few years after 1959, their activities were curtailed after the Cuban rapprochement with the Soviet Union, and within 3 years the few remaining members were jailed and Trotskyism in Cuba ceased to exist. One of the things to keep in mind is that, or not one of the things to keep in mind, one of the things I read recently was that, what's his name? What the hell is it? I always forget his, actual name. Is it Jacobson or Jackson? I always want to say Jackson. Trotsky's assassin. Was welcomed in Cuba after he was imprisoned in Mexico. Ramon Mercader. Ramon Mercader lived from 1913 to 1978 and was a Spanish communist and NKVD secret agent who assassinated the revolutionary Leon Trotsky in Mexico City in August 1940. Mercader was imprisoned for 19 years and 18 months in Mexico for murdering the exile with an ice axe. In 1960, after release from the Mexican imprisonment, Mercader was awarded the Hero of Soviet Union Medal and the Order of Lenin Medal and lived at different times in Cuba, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia. I want to see, because I was told that, I read in like a thing from Max Shachtman that the Che Guevara met personally with Mercader. Let's see if there's any mention of that in the Wikipedia article. It says, after almost 20 years in prison, Mercader was released from Mexico City's Palacio de Lecumberri prison on the 6th of May, 1960. He moved to Havana, Cuba, where Fidel Castro's new socialist government welcomed him. In 1961, Mercader moved to the Soviet Union and subsequently was presented with the country's highest decoration, the Hero of Soviet Union, presented personally by Alexander Shelepin, the head of the KGB. He divided his time between Czechoslovakia, from where he traveled to different countries, Cuba, where he was the advisor of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and the Soviet Union for the rest of his life. He married a Mexican named Rogalia in prison after 1940 and had 2 children. Mercader died in Havana in 1978 of lung cancer. He is buried under the name Ramon Ivanovich Lopez in Moscow's Kuntsevo Cemetery. So I don't see anything here. That doesn't mean it's not the case. But in the thing that I read, according to Shachtman, Mercader was greeted at the pier when he arrived in Cuba by Che Guevara. Anyway, back to the text. Only in France, 1968, were there any significant Trotskyist forces, yet Birchall in 1987 and other sympathetic writers have clearly established that whilst the French Trotskyist movement undoubtedly gained members and influence, it was unable to overcome its small size, sectarianism, and in some cases ultra-leftism. In Portugal, the Trotskyist movement was even weaker at the time of the 1974-75 Carnation Revolution, clearly overshadowed by the Armed Forces movement and the Portuguese Communist Party. See Robinson, 1987. The recent history of Portuguese academic Raquel Varela in 2019 is highly sympathetic to the revolutionary cause and scathing about representative democracy, but still devotes only a few lines to the marginal forces of Portuguese Trotskyism. In the elections held immediately after the strikes and protests in these 2 countries, France 1969 and Portugal 1975, the derisory votes for Trotskyist candidates only confirmed their marginal status in national politics. Overall, therefore, the record of Trotskyist movements in the protests and revolutions of the 20th century is one of comprehensive irrelevance. But why is this so? Why have Trotskyist groups repeatedly failed to build mass organizations despite almost a century of organizing effort in over 70 countries spread across 6 continents? One of the most common answers offered by Trotskyists themselves, the negative effects of the Stalinist parties, has long ceased to be a significant factor in a growing number of countries, and we must therefore turn our attention elsewhere in the search for answers. The argument in the next chapter will be that the doctrinaire worldview of the Trotskyist movement embodies critical analytical weaknesses that have negated its appeal to all but tiny sections of any national population. It will also be argued that these weaknesses are integral, not contingent, components of Trotskyism and are therefore irredeemable. It is important to notice, however, that the succession of splits and divisions that have plagued the Trotskyist movement from its inception have crystallized into discrete ideological families, mainstream, orthodox, institutional, etc. Whilst all Trotskyist families will display some or all of the weaknesses to be described shortly, it does not follow that every weakness can be identified in any particular Trotskyist group. New section. Trotskyist-led social movements. Against this evidence about cycles of protest and revolutionary situations, it might be argued that Trotskyist groups have played a key role in creating and sustaining a range of significant and influential social movements in Britain. For example, the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, the VSC, was launched in 1966 by the International Group. From 1968, the International Marxist Group, IMG, the Anti-Nazi League, ANL, was the creation of the Socialist Workers' Party in 1977. The Anti-Poll Tax Federation, a campaign against a regressive property tax, was launched by the Militant Tendency, a Labour Party interest group. In 1989, and the Stop the War Coalition was founded in 2001 by activists from the Socialist Workers' Party and the Communist Party of Britain. All these bodies organized extremely large protests and demonstrations and enjoyed varying degrees of success. The Vietnam Solidarity Campaign protests mobilized up to 100,000 people in two major demonstrations called in March and October 1968, although the war continued for another 7 years. In February 2003, the Stop the War demonstration against the invasion of Iraq mobilized over 1 million people, although the war went ahead. In contrast, a series of anti-Nazi League marches and rallies between 1977 and 1979 did make an impact, helping to reduce significantly the size of the far-right National Front vote in by-elections and in the 1979 general elections. Finally, the Anti-Poll Tax Federation used a combination of mass civil disobedience, non-payment of the tax, as well as marches and rallies to try to discredit the Conservative government's poll tax. Following the removal of Margaret Thatcher as party leader and prime minister in November 1990, the new prime minister, John Major, moved swiftly to abolish the tax, a clear victory for the Federation's campaign. See Kelly, 2018, pages 199 to 215. Two of these movements were enormously successful and achieved their ostensible objectives, but whilst the other two movements failed to prevent the Vietnam and Iraq wars, they did succeed in mobilizing large numbers of people in collective action. However, the impact of these social movements on their Trotskyist architects was very limited. The IMG certainly increased its membership in the late 1960s, but so too did other Trotskyist groups, including the Militant Tendency, which had little to do with the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, and the Heliite Socialist Labor League, which was actively hostile. During the lifetime of the Anti-Nazi League, from 1977 to 79, the Socialist Workers' Party did make recruits from the League, but its net membership actually declined, from around 4,300 to about 3,800, a trend experienced by several other Trotskyist groups, such as the IMG, International Marxist Group, and the Socialist Labor League. See Birchall, 2011. The Militant Tendency dominated the highly successful National Anti-Poll Tax Federation, but shrunk in size by around 1,000 between 1989 and 1991. As its members were steadily expelled from the Labour Party. Finally, although the Socialist Workers' Party recruited from participants at the massive Stop the War demonstrations, it still suffered a net loss of around 3,000 members between 2001 and 2004. Why did the social movements produce so few membership gains for their Trotskyist creators? One interpretation is that they follow the precepts of successful movement organizing and downplay the rival sectarian principles of Trotskyist doctrine. They all focused on clear and discrete goals that were achievable within capitalism. They embraced a wide range of social forces, including members of the Labour Party and in some cases the Liberal Party, and their core demands appealed to a potentially large constituency. In order to meet these criteria, the leaders of these movements downplayed the revolutionary slogans and ideas of Trotskyism because they would have alienated large numbers of people. The Anti-Nazi League, for example, did not overtly link racism to capitalism and imperialism in order to maintain a broad coalition of diverse political forces. See Renton, 2006. That being the case, it is hardly surprising that so few anti-Nazi League supporters and members took the leap from participation in a large popular single-issue campaign to membership of a small revolutionary Trotskyist organization. The Bolivian, new section, the Bolivian and Sri Lankan success stories, ? Before turning to the causes of Trotskyist weakness and failure, it is important to examine the two countries in which Trotskyist groups appeared to have become mass parties with substantial influence, namely Bolivia and Sri Lanka in the 1940s and 1950s. See, for example, Frank and Ben Said, 2010, page 98 to 103, Maitan, 2019, 126 to 40, 185 to 90. The Bolivian Partido Obrero Revolucionario, POR, was formed in 1935, and although dominated by Trotskyists, existed for several years as a broad left party until the main non-Trotskyist grouping was expelled in 1938. The party gradually built significant support amongst tin miners, the largest and most powerful segment of the country's small working class, so much so that in 1946 the Miners' Federation published what became known as the, quote, Thesis of Pulacayo, end quote, a Trotskyist-inspired document largely drafted by POR leader Guillermo Lora, which asserted the centrality of class struggle and declared that the road to socialism lay through, quote, permanent revolution, end quote. Although the POR competed for influence with the Bolivian Communist Party, formed only in 1940, its main challenger was the MNR, Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario, an organization variously described as social democratic, nationalist, and populist because of its policies of land reform and nationalization. After the MNR's landslide victory in the 1951 election, the army determined to halt any further leftward advance and seized power. The following year witnessed the Bolivian Revolution, a popular and successful uprising involving workers, peasants, and indigenous peoples, and led by the MNR with support from the POR. Once the new MNR government began to embark on its reforms, the POR was thrown into disarray. A grouping around Lura sought to work with the left wing of the new government, whilst a rival grouping remained committed to a fresh seizure of power. Adhering to the letter and spirit of the theory of permanent revolution, the inevitable result was a split which depleted POR membership and signaled the effective end of its brief period of mass influence. By the time of the 1956 presidential election, the POR candidate received just 0.25% of the total vote. In Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon, the Lama Sama Samaja Party, LSSP, was founded by students in 1935 as a radical left-wing party which included both communists and Trotskyists among its rapidly growing membership until the expulsion of the communists in 1940. Membership grew rapidly and went hand in hand with electoral success as two members of the LSSP were elected to the legislature in 1936. After World War II, it began organizing amongst tea plantation workers where it built up a considerable base, and in 1947 further increased its parliamentary representation to become briefly the main opposition party. Throughout the 1940s and early 1960s, its vote hovered around 10%, giving the party a similar proportion of parliamentary deputies, but there were growing tensions over the appropriate relations to adopt towards non-Marxist parties, particularly the increasingly influential socialist, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. The dominant group within the LSSP looked with increasing favor on a policy of critical support for successive socialist governments, but matters came to a head in 1964 when the party decided to join the government as a junior coalition partner. Under pressure from the Fourth International to repudiate governmental participation, the LSSP inevitably split. The majority quit the Fourth International and remained in government, whilst the minority remained inside the Fourth International, accusing the majority of having abandoned Trotskyism. See Alexander 1991a and Jupp 1978. There are clearly many differences between these two countries in the early 1950s, and there are four that stand out. Bolivia had then enjoyed over a century of political independence, whereas Ceylon was a British colony until independence in 1948. Bolivia had experienced a succession of military coups, but in Ceylon they were unknown. Tin mines were a key contributor to Bolivian exports. In Ceylon, it was tea plantations, and finally Bolivia had a predominantly Catholic country, while Ceylon was dominated by Buddhism. Yet despite these and many other differences between their economic and political systems as well as their cultures, the countries share one attribute that renders them unique in the history of Trotskyism. They are the only two countries in the world where the creation of the first Trotskyist organization preceded rather than preceded the formation of a communist party. The Bolivian POR was formed in 1935, but the Partido de la Izquierda Revolucionario, a communist and pro-Soviet party, was created only in 1940, and the quote official end quote Bolivian Communist Party was formed only in 1950 as a split from the PIR. See John 2009. In Sri Lanka, the LSSP was founded in 1935, but the Communist Party was created only in 1940 as a split from the LSSP, initially known as the United Socialist Party until its communist name changed in 1943. In contrast to every other Trotskyist party, the POR and the LSSP both worked briefly in political environments and labor movements that were not dominated by a virulently anti-Trotskyist organization. This, quote, first mover advantage, end quote, allowed both organizations to establish branches, periodicals, membership, and influence without the communist hostility and disruption faced by their counterparts in every other country. Yet that circumstance, unique to Bolivia and Sri Lanka, is most likely the principal source of the short-lived influence of the Trotskyist movement in those countries. Final section. Conclusions. For many years, Trotskyists argued that their growth and influence was severely constrained by the hegemonic position of mass communist parties, social democratic parties, and, quote, conservative, end quote, trade union bureaucracies. The prolonged decline of world communism that gathered pace from the late 1950s, coupled with the world strike wave and social movement protest that erupted in the 1960s, finally provided a window of opportunity for Trotskyist growth. But although Communist Party decline accelerated through the 1980s and continued in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, the golden age of the Trotskyist movement crashed to a halt. Far from ushering in the renaissance of, quote, revolutionary Marxism, end quote, the collapse of the majority of Stalinist states was almost as damaging for world Trotskyism as for the world's communist parties. Nor has the Trotskyist movement been able to exploit any of the numerous protests, rebellions, insurgencies, or revolutions so characteristic of the late 20th and the late 20th and 21st centuries. Neither in Europe, Asia, the Arab world, or Latin America have Trotskyist groups made any major breakthroughs on the back of mass political protests. This is not because of a lack of radicalization among protesters and strikers, but rather because their radicalism has been channeled politically through a variety of non-Trotskyist forces, primarily radical left and green parties. In some cases, radicalism has been channeled through the social movements created by Trotskyists, such as the anti-Vietnam War and anti-Iraq War organizations. The evidence shows that even where such campaigns have successfully mobilized large numbers of people, the membership gains for their Trotskyist instigators are minimal. Finally, the two examples often cited of mass Trotskyist influence, Bolivia and Sri Lanka, in the 1950s, both turn out to be exceptional cases. They are the only two countries in the world where Trotskyist organizations came into existence prior to the creation of pro-Moscow communist parties and were therefore able to achieve hegemonic positions on the left of their labor movements, albeit very briefly. That's the end of the piece, or end of the chapter. I'm going to read some of the notes here, just because they're short, and it's only 3 of them, like half a page. Note 1, which I don't know what this is in reference to, but the full list is as follows. Africa: Angola, Benin, Republic of Congo, Mozambique, Namibia, Tunisia. Asia: Afghanistan, Australia, Cambodia, Malaysia, Mongolia, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Thailand, and Ukraine. Europe: Albania, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Estonia, Great Britain, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro, Netherlands, Poland, Romania, San Marino, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Latin America: Dominican Republic, Grenada, Honduras, Jamaica, and Mexico. In some of these countries, dissident elements opposed to party dissolution, formed or, quote, refounded, end quote, new communist parties, e.g. Communist Party of Great Britain, Communist Refoundation, Italy, and the New Communist Party of the Netherlands. The full list in date order is GDR, Algeria, new footnote. The full list in order is GDR, Algeria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique, Laos, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Iran, Nicaragua, Poland, Grenada, the Eastern European 7, and the USSR. Thanks for listening.